It started on a rainy night, the kind of night where the streets shine like glass under the streetlights and the air feels heavy with secrets. I was tired, just another shift behind the wheel, picking up strangers and dropping them off. But then she appeared, elegant, graceful, wrapped in perfume and silence. She slid into the back seat like she didn't belong in my world at all, and yet for those 20 minutes, our lives touched. When we stopped, she handed me $100 bill for a simple ride, her eyes lingering on mine as if she saw something no one else ever had. I thought it would end there, but her next offer changed everything. The night had that kind of weight only rain can bring, heavy and soft at the same time, as if the world was being pressed into silence. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red against the wet streets, and the wipers moved back and forth like a slow heartbeat, steady but tired. I had already been driving for hours, my body aching from the seat, my mind wandering between bills, assignments, and the quiet loneliness that always seemed to ride along in the passenger seat with me. Driving was never my dream, but it paid for books, rent, and just enough groceries to keep going. Most passengers never looked twice at me. I was just the driver, invisible, a blur in their busy nights. But when she stepped into my car, everything shifted in a way I couldn't explain. Not then. She appeared like a scene from a film I didn't know I was watching, tall, poised, wearing clothes that spoke of money I'd never touched. The umbrella she held dripped against the curb, her perfume sliding into the air like a secret. She didn't hurry, didn't fumble with her phone, didn't rush me to start the car. Instead, she settled into the back seat like she had all the time in the world, her posture straight, her silence deliberate. For a moment I caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes dark, lips pressed into a line that looked more like exhaustion than irritation. There was something in her stillness that made me want to ask 100 questions, but I bit my tongue. Passengers hated talkative drivers, and I had learned my role long ago. We pulled onto the slick road, tires hissing against the water. She gave me the destination in a low, soft voice, the kind of voice that could almost disappear into the hum of the engine if I wasn't listening carefully. I nodded, more to myself than to her, and let the silence fill the space between us. Normally, silence from a passenger was easy. Tonight, it wasn't. Her presence was thick, magnetic, as though she carried a story too heavy for one person. Every so often, I glanced at her reflection again, and once, I caught her looking back at me through the mirror. Neither of us spoke, but in that brief moment her gaze felt like a question I didn't know how to answer. 20 minutes. That was all. 20 minutes of watching lights slide across her face, 20 minutes of wondering who she was and why she felt so far away despite being right there. When I pulled up to the address, a building far too expensive for someone like me to even step inside, I expected the usual quick payment and a door slamming shut. Instead, she lingered. She leaned forward, close enough that I caught the warmth of her breath in the cool air, and slipped a bill into my hand. I looked down, confused at first, then my chest tightened. $100. For a short ride that barely deserved my throat went dry. I turned to protest, but she was already watching me with a look that was unreadable, half daring, half tender. For your time, she said simply, her voice calm, as though this was nothing unusual. But it was unusual to me. Nobody handed me money without expecting something in return. Nobody looked at me like I was worth more than the bare minimum. And yet, here she was, her eyes lingering on mine in a way that left me rattled. I opened my mouth to ask why, to hand it back, to say anything that might keep me from feeling indebted, but I couldn't. Something in her gaze silenced me. Something in the way she carried herself made me feel that if I questioned it too much, the moment would shatter. So I just nodded, fingers tightening around the bill like I needed proof it was real. She leaned back, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the rain. The streetlight caught the sheen of her umbrella, the glint of her earrings, the outline of someone who didn't belong to the same tired world I was scraping through. Before she closed the door, she paused. Just long enough to tilt her head, to let her eyes meet mine once more. "Maybe we'll meet again," she murmured, and the door clicked shut. I watched her walk toward the building, the echo of her words pressing harder against me than the $100 bill in my palm. The rain kept falling, the city kept moving, and I sat there in the driver's seat with the engine running, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted inside me. Something small but undeniable. I didn't know her name then. I didn't know her story, or why someone like her would even remember someone like me. But as the taillights of the next car passed and the night swallowed me whole again, I realized I was still staring at the doorway she had disappeared through. My chest felt strange, half heavier, half lighter. And though I told myself to drive away, to forget, I couldn't stop replaying her words. Maybe we'll meet again. It was only 20 minutes, but it felt like the first chapter of something I wasn't ready for, something I couldn't stop myself from wanting. The $100 bill stayed in my wallet for days, untouched, folded neatly as though it held more value than its number suggested. Every time I opened it to pay for coffee or groceries, my eyes fell on that crisp paper and my mind went back to her. The ride replayed in my head like a loop I couldn't turn off, the rain-slick streets, the perfume that clung to the air, the weight of her eyes in the rearview mirror, and those final words, maybe we'll meet again. I told myself not to read too much into it. Rich people probably spoke like that all the time, scattering words like coins, leaving others to chase their meanings. But deep inside, I wanted to believe she meant it, that she hadn't just said it to be polite. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a new ride request. The name on the app froze me in place, Clara. The screen lit up like a secret revealed too soon. My stomach tightened as I accepted the request, half excited, half anxious, as though stepping into something I wasn't prepared for. When I pulled up to the location, she was already there, standing under the awning of a small boutique. This time she didn't climb into the back seat. She opened the front door instead, slipped into the passenger side like she belonged there, and gave me a small smile that caught me off guard. I don't need a ride, she said, fastening her seatbelt anyway. Her tone was calm, deliberate, like she was testing me. I just didn't know another way to reach you. Her words pulled the air out of my chest. I glanced at her, trying to mask the shock, and managed a small nod. All right, I said, though it sounded more like a question. She rested her hands in her lap, fingers brushing against one another with the elegance of someone who had always been in control, but the way she avoided my eyes told a different story. I was wondering if you could help me with something, she continued. Not driving, exactly. Just, company. She paused on that last word, letting it hang between us like a fragile truth. Company. It was strange, hearing it from someone who seemed to have everything, money, beauty, the kind of confidence that made rooms turn quiet. But there was a crack in her voice, faint but undeniable, and in that crack I heard something I recognized, loneliness. I hesitated. My mind screamed questions. Why me? What did she want? What did this mean? And yet, instead of refusing, I found myself nodding again. Company, I repeated softly, as though saying it would help me understand. She smiled, not wide, but enough to soften her sharp edges. Yes, she whispered, almost like a confession. So I drove her, not to some grand destination, but to a series of small, ordinary places. A bookstore where she lingered between aisles, running her hands across covers as if searching for something she'd lost long ago. A coffee shop where she ordered nothing but tea, letting it go cold as we talked about trivial things, the weather, the city, how the rain always made the world seem heavier. At first, it felt strange. She asked questions that cut deeper than casual conversation, questions about my studies, my family, what I wanted out of life. No passenger had ever asked me that. No one had cared enough to. And yet here she was, listening like my words carried weight, nodding thoughtfully, her gaze steady and patient. As the day unfolded, I began to notice the contradictions in her. Clara carried herself like someone untouchable, but every time she laughed, really laughed, it sounded fragile, like something rare that needed protecting. She talked about travel, about art, about places I had only ever seen in pictures, but when the conversation shifted toward love, her smile faltered. She didn't give details, but the shadows in her expression told me enough. Heartbreak had left its mark on her, and no amount of wealth could cover the scar. When I dropped her back at her building, she didn't reach for her wallet. Instead, she turned to me, her eyes soft, almost vulnerable. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying a weight that money couldn't measure. "I know it's unusual. But it means something to me." I wanted to ask why me, what she saw in me, why she would choose a stranger with nothing to offer but time. But the words stayed locked behind my lips. She opened the door, stepped out, and before closing it, leaned back in. "Maybe I'll see you again," she said, the same way she had before, but this time her voice carried less mystery and more hope. And when she walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the glow of the lobby, I sat in the car with a feeling I couldn't shake. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It wasn't just the thrill of something unusual. It was a connection, thin but undeniable, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the stirrings of something I didn't dare name. Days passed, but Clara's presence lingered like a perfume that clings to fabric long after the person is gone. Every detail of her stayed with me, the way her voice softened when she spoke about small things, the way her eyes shifted when pain threatened to show itself, the way she had asked for something so simple, company, as if it were rarer than gold. I told myself not to think about her, not to hope for another call, but the truth was I waited for it. Every time my phone buzzed, my chest tightened, half in fear, half in desperate wanting. And then, on a quiet Friday night, her name lit up my screen again. Only this time, the request was not a ride across town or errands to run. It was an address. Her address. I sat outside her building longer than I should have, palms damp against the steering wheel. I had no idea what I was walking into. Wealth had always belonged to another world, one that looked beautiful from a distance but closed its doors when I came near. Part of me wanted to turn around, drive away, and forget the whole thing before it became something I couldn't handle. But curiosity was stronger. Or maybe it wasn't curiosity at all. Maybe it was the memory of her eyes searching mine, of her laughter sounding fragile yet real, of that quiet loneliness she carried like an invisible chain. So I killed the engine, stepped out into the night, and let the doorman guide me inside. The elevator ride up felt endless. My reflection in the mirrored walls showed someone who didn't belong, faded jeans, tired sneakers, a jacket that had seen better years. I brushed my hair with my fingers, as if that would make a difference, but deep down I knew nothing I wore would make me fit into her world. Still, when the elevator doors slid open, there she was, waiting in the hallway, barefoot, with her hair tied back loosely and no trace of the carefully polished woman I had first met. Seeing her like that, stripped of the armor wealth provided, made my breath catch. She smiled faintly when she saw me, a smile that felt more genuine than any I had seen from her before. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside to let me enter. Her home was exactly what I imagined it would be, and yet not at all. It was grand, spacious, filled with art and expensive furniture, but it didn't feel lived in. The kind of place designed to impress, but not to comfort. The air felt still, too quiet, as though the walls themselves had been holding their breath for too long. I followed her through the living room into a smaller space, cozier, with shelves lined with books and a faint scent of lavender in the air. She gestured for me to sit, and for a moment we were two women in different worlds, brought into the same room by something neither of us could name. It was only after she disappeared briefly and returned that my heart stumbled. She had changed into silk pajamas, pale and flowing, soft against her skin, the kind of fabric that whispered with each movement. She looked different, less untouchable, more human, more vulnerable. I tried not to stare, tried to remind myself that this wasn't what it looked like, but it was impossible not to notice the intimacy of the moment. She caught my eyes lingering and gave a small, knowing smile, not mocking, not challenging, just acknowledging the truth between us. "I don't want you to think I invited you here for anything inappropriate," she said gently, settling into the armchair across from me with a cup of tea. I don't like being alone." Not tonight. There was something in the way she said it, a quiet honesty that carried more weight than any explanation she could give. She handed me a cup too, the porcelain warm against my palms, and we sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint hum of rain against the windows. Eventually, she began to talk. Not the surface-level chatter we had shared before, but something deeper, rawer. She told me about the loneliness that came with her world, about people who loved her money more than her, about friends who disappeared when she stopped giving, about a partner who had once promised forever but left when forever became inconvenient. Her voice trembled at times, and though she tried to keep it steady, I could hear the ache underneath every word. For the first time, the polished, elegant woman I had met in the back seat of my car was gone, and in her place sat someone fragile, someone wounded, someone painfully human. I found myself sharing too. Stories of late nights driving, of skipping meals to pay rent, of the constant fear of falling behind in school. I didn't know why I told her these things. I never spoke about them to anyone, but she listened in a way no one else ever had. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't pity. She just listened, her eyes fixed on mine, as if every word I said mattered. It felt strange, dangerous even, to be seen so clearly. The hours slipped away unnoticed. The tea went cold. The rain eased outside. At one point, she laughed softly at something I said, and the sound filled the hollow air like light slipping into a dark room. When she laughed again, she leaned her head back, and I couldn't help but notice how the silk of her pajamas caught the lamplight, how her skin seemed almost to glow. Desire stirred quietly, something I didn't want to admit, something I forced down, reminding myself she had invited me here for company, nothing else. But even as I reminded myself, my heart betrayed me. When it grew late and I rose to leave, she walked me to the door. Her hand brushed mine as she handed me my jacket, and the touch, though brief, sent a current through me I hadn't felt in years. She looked at me then, her eyes softer than ever, and whispered, "Thank you. You don't know how much it means, just to have someone sit with me." I wanted to tell her that I understood, that it meant something to me too, that she wasn't the only one who had been rescued tonight. But the words stayed trapped in my chest. I only nodded, and when I stepped back into the hallway, I carried with me more than just the warmth of her home. I carried a pull I could no longer deny, a pull that would only grow stronger. Clara called me again not long after that night, and soon it became a rhythm, a pattern I didn't know I needed until I found myself waiting for it. At first it was only evenings when she seemed lonelier than usual, but before long it was almost every night. Sometimes she would send a simple message, "Come by if you're free," and other times she would request a ride just to end up directing me back to her place. I stopped asking questions. It was never really about the ride. It was about the hours spent together, hours where the world outside seemed to vanish and it was just the two of us, two women with different scars finding some kind of shelter in each other's presence. The late-night talks became our ritual. I would sit across from her in that cozy library room with the shelves and lavender scent, sometimes curled up in the armchair, sometimes cross-legged on the rug, and she would be in her silk pajamas, her hair tied back or let loose over her shoulders. She talked in ways I had never heard anyone talk before, not because of her vocabulary or her education, but because she let down her guard, piece by piece, and trusted me with parts of her she didn't show the world. She spoke of the betrayal that had shaped her, the partner who had left her at her weakest moment, the friendships that dissolved once her generosity dried up. There were nights when her voice shook, when her eyes glistened with tears she tried to hide, and I would feel my own throat tighten as though her pain had seeped into me. In return, I found myself opening up too. I told her about my childhood, the endless arguments in my family's tiny apartment, the feeling of being overlooked, the way I had learned to survive by making myself small and unnoticed. I told her about my constant struggle to balance school with work, the weight of debt always pressing down, the exhaustion of giving so much and still never being enough. She didn't flinch at my words, didn't pity me the way others sometimes did. Instead, she listened with a quiet intensity, her eyes fixed on mine as though every sentence carried meaning she wanted to remember. It felt dangerous, this exchange of truths, as if by sharing them we were binding ourselves to each other in ways neither of us could take back. But it wasn't only sadness that tied us together. There was laughter too, sharp and unexpected, bursting into the quiet like sunlight breaking through clouds. She laughed when I told her about ridiculous passengers I had driven, the ones who argued about music or spilled drinks in the back seat. I laughed when she admitted she couldn't cook anything beyond scrambled eggs, despite having a kitchen worth more than my entire apartment building. There were moments when we laughed so hard our shoulders shook, and in those moments, her home no longer felt like a cold mansion but a place alive with warmth. The chemistry between us grew slowly, in the little things. The way her hand lingered a second too long when she passed me a cup of tea. The way her eyes softened whenever I walked into the room. The way my stomach flipped whenever her laughter filled the air. Neither of us spoke about it, neither of us crossed the invisible line, but the tension hummed quietly, unspoken but undeniable. I could feel it in the way my heart raced when her knee brushed mine by accident, in the way her voice seemed to drop softer when it was just the two of us, in the silence that stretched between sentences, heavy and electric. One night she pulled out a bottle of wine and insisted we share it. I tried to refuse, worried about what alcohol might reveal, but she laughed and poured it anyway. We sat on the floor, the glasses between us, and she told me stories of places she had visited, sunsets in Italy, nights in Paris, mornings on beaches where the sand glittered like gold. I listened, both enchanted and distant, because those stories belonged to a world I had never touched. But then she leaned closer, lowering her voice, and told me the part she never told anyone, how she had felt utterly alone in each of those beautiful places, how the beauty meant nothing without someone to share it with. That confession silenced me, because in that moment I realized that despite everything she had, she envied me, not for what I possessed, but for the way I still carried hope, the way I still believed in something better. I went home that night with my mind in chaos. The line between friendship and something more was blurring, and I didn't know if it was my imagination or if she felt it too. I told myself to be careful, to keep my distance, to remember that I was just company, nothing more. But every time I tried to remind myself, her laugh echoed in my chest, her eyes burned into my memory, and I couldn't stop the pull that grew stronger with each passing night. The mansion no longer felt intimidating. It felt like a place I belonged, not because of the furniture or the wealth, but because of her. She had become the reason I showed up, the reason I stayed longer than I should, the reason I left with an ache that only seeing her again could soothe. And though neither of us had spoken it aloud, though no boundary had been crossed, something was changing between us. I could feel it in my bones, in the quiet spaces of our conversations, in the way her presence filled something empty inside me. Whatever it was growing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the silence between us broke. The night that changed everything began like so many others. I had grown used to the quiet invitations, the soft texts that came without pressure, just a simple, "Come by if you can." That evening I almost didn't go. I was tired from work, my body drained, and part of me feared what was happening between us. The unspoken tension had grown so thick it clung to every glance, every touch, every silence. But when I saw her name on my phone, something inside me pushed me forward. I found myself driving through the dark streets again, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual, my heart heavy with anticipation. When she opened the door, she looked different, softer, as though she had shed the polished image she sometimes wore. Her silk pajamas glistened faintly under the warm glow of her hallway light, and her hair fell loosely around her shoulders. She smiled, but it wasn't the careful smile I had grown used to. It was small, hesitant, almost nervous. That alone unsettled me. Clara never looked nervous. She was the kind of woman who carried herself with a composure I envied, and yet tonight, as she led me inside, her hands trembled slightly as she brushed her hair back from her face. We sat in the same familiar room, the one that had become ours, surrounded by books and quiet. For a while we spoke about nothing important. I told her about a rude passenger earlier that day. She laughed politely. She mentioned a gallery opening she was invited to. I smiled and nodded. But beneath the small talk, something restless moved between us. Her gaze lingered too long, my words stumbled more than usual, and every second stretched taut, ready to snap. Finally she set her cup of tea down, the porcelain clinking softly against the table. She leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my pulse stumble. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice quieter than usual, as if afraid of her own words. I swallowed hard, nodding, though my chest tightened with dread and hope all at once. She looked down for a moment, her hands twisting in her lap, before meeting my eyes again. "I have feelings for you," she confessed, each word heavy and fragile. My breath caught, the room spinning slightly, because though I had felt it building, hearing it aloud was different. It was real. It was undeniable. She shook her head quickly, her eyes shining with something like fear. "But I don't want you to think that this is about money, or about what I can give you. I can't bear the thought of you seeing me that way. You're the first person in years who has looked at me like I'm more than what I own." Her voice cracked, and the rawness of it cut through me. I wanted to speak, but my throat had closed up. A storm of emotion surged inside me, relief, because I had wanted this too, fear, because it changed everything, doubt, because I didn't want to be mistaken for someone chasing her wealth, and longing, deep and unshakable, because she was sitting right there, vulnerable, offering me her truth. I reached for her hand without thinking, my fingers brushing against hers, and when she didn't pull away, I held on. The warmth of her skin sent a current through me, one that settled deep in my chest. For a moment we just sat like that, our hands intertwined, silence speaking louder than any words. I wanted to tell her I felt it too, that I had been fighting it for weeks, that her laughter had become the sound I craved and her presence the light I needed. But fear kept me still. Fear of stepping into something I couldn't undo, fear of losing her if it went wrong, fear of being seen as less than genuine. Her thumb brushed against my knuckles, a gentle motion that made my breath hitch. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered, as if reading the war inside me. "I just needed you to know. I needed to stop pretending." Her honesty disarmed me, left me vulnerable in ways I hadn't expected. My heart pounded as I finally forced myself to speak, my voice trembling. I care about you, Clara. More than I thought I could. But I don't want you to think I'm here for what you have. I don't want to be another person who takes from you." Her eyes softened, a tear slipping free, though she smiled through it. "That's exactly why I trust you," she said, her voice breaking but certain. "Because you don't see me as a bank or a title. You see me. And I've been so starved for that." The tension between us swelled, thick and almost unbearable. Our faces were close now, close enough that I could see every detail of her expression, the fear, the hope, the longing. My heart screamed to close the space, to kiss her, to let the wall between us finally fall. But I hesitated, frozen by the weight of what it meant. Instead, I squeezed her hand tighter, letting that be my answer for now. That night we didn't cross the line, not fully. But everything had changed. When I finally left her home, the night air felt charged, my chest aching with both joy and fear. The taste of her confession lingered like the ghost of a kiss we hadn't shared, a promise hovering in the silence. I knew nothing would ever be the same again, and though part of me trembled at the risk, another part burned with the certainty that whatever this was, it was only just beginning. After that night, nothing felt the same. We still sat together in the same room, drinking tea, sharing stories, and laughing at things that probably weren't that funny, but there was a new undercurrent beneath it all, a current that tugged at us every moment. The air between us felt heavier, charged with something unspoken, something both of us could feel but neither dared to push too far. Every time our hands brushed, I felt the spark of it. Every time her eyes lingered on mine, I felt the weight of what she had confessed. I carried her words everywhere I went, turning them over in my mind when I drove through empty streets at night, when I lay in bed too restless to sleep, when I stared at my textbooks but couldn't focus on a single line. She had feelings for me. And I had feelings for her. That truth lived between us now, changing every interaction, every glance, every silence. It wasn't long before her care for me began to show itself in ways I wasn't sure how to handle. One evening, as we sat together, she leaned forward and asked how my classes were going. I shrugged, muttering something vague about how I was keeping up, but she pressed further. When I admitted I had been skipping lectures to take more shifts driving, she frowned, the lines of concern deepening across her face. "That's not fair to you," she said firmly. "You shouldn't have to sacrifice your future just to make ends meet." I laughed it off, trying to make light of it, but she didn't laugh with me. Instead, she looked me straight in the eye and said quietly, "Let me help you." The words made my stomach twist. Help. The one thing I had taught myself never to ask for, never to accept, because help always came with a cost. I shook my head immediately, my pride flaring up like a shield. "I can't," I whispered, the weight of the $100 bill still burning in my memory. "I don't want to be another person who takes from you." She reached across the table then, her hand warm as it covered mine, her voice softer but no less insistent. "You're not taking. I want to give. Not because I pity you, not because I see you as less, but because I believe in you. Because I care." The sincerity in her eyes nearly broke me. Part of me wanted to say yes, to let her take the weight off my shoulders, to finally breathe without fear of falling behind. But another part of me screamed against it, terrified of what it would mean, terrified of becoming dependent, terrified of being misunderstood. I pulled my hand away gently, trying to steady my voice. "I need to do this on my own. If I let you pay for things, if I let you carry me, then what are we? What am I?" My voice cracked at the end, betraying the fear I tried so hard to hide. Her eyes softened, but her gaze didn't waver. "We're two people who care about each other. That's what we are," she whispered. There was such conviction in her tone that it left me speechless. She leaned back then, giving me space, as if she understood the battle raging inside me. The silence stretched between us, filled with the echo of everything we hadn't said. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness but from the weight of being seen so deeply. No one had ever looked at me the way she did. No one had ever cared enough to fight for my future the way she was willing to. As the days passed, our bond only grew deeper. We spent hours together, sometimes talking until the first light of dawn slipped through her curtains. She showed me sides of herself no one else got to see, the silly jokes, the clumsy moments, the bursts of laughter that made her seem so young and free. And I, in turn, let her see me without my walls, without the mask of composure I wore for the world. She became my safe place, the one person I could be completely myself with. And yet, beneath all the comfort and joy, the tension simmered stronger than ever. Every smile, every glance, every accidental touch carried the weight of unspoken desire. There were nights when the closeness became almost unbearable. Once, when we sat side by side on the couch, our knees touching, our shoulders brushing, I felt her hand graze mine and linger. The silence that followed was heavy, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. I wanted to take her hand fully, to close the space, to let the wall between us finally fall. But instead, I froze, afraid of what might happen if I gave in. Afraid of the line between us disappearing completely, even though it already had in every way that mattered. But what grew even more powerful than the desire was the way she pushed me to believe in myself. She never let me speak about my dreams as if they were impossible. Whenever I doubted, she reminded me of my strength. Whenever I spoke of quitting, she reminded me of everything I had already overcome. She breathed life into the parts of me I had let wither under exhaustion and fear. And slowly, I began to feel it too, that maybe I wasn't just surviving, maybe I could reach for something more. Still, the conflict remained. I lay awake at night torn between gratitude and pride, between longing and fear. I wanted her, not for her wealth, not for her home, not for the comfort she could offer, but for her heart, for the way she looked at me, for the way she made me feel less alone in a world that had always felt so empty. Yet every time I came close to admitting it, the words got stuck. Because once spoken, there would be no going back. One night, as I left her home, she walked me to the door and lingered there, her hand brushing mine in the faintest of touches. She looked at me with an intensity that made my chest ache and whispered, "You don't always have to be so strong. Let someone love you the way you deserve." The words echoed inside me long after I drove away, sinking deep into the cracks of my heart. For the first time, I began to wonder if maybe she was right, if maybe love wasn't about pride or independence, but about letting yourself be held when the weight became too much. The night it happened, everything felt ordinary at first. I had gone to her place after a long day of classes and driving, my body aching and my mind cluttered. She opened the door in her silk pajamas, her hair tumbling loose around her face, and something about the sight of her made the exhaustion melt away. I stepped inside, breathing in the familiar lavender scent, and followed her to the living room where the fireplace glowed softly. She had set out tea and a small plate of fruit on the table, as if she already knew I hadn't eaten. It was such a simple gesture, but it made my throat tighten with unspoken gratitude. We sat together, side by side, sipping tea in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable but was charged with something more. I could feel it in the way her eyes lingered on me, in the way her hand rested so close to mine on the cushion between us. The unspoken words were louder than anything we could have said. She started talking about her day, little things about calls she had taken and books she had been reading, but her voice was softer, her tone gentler than usual. At some point she turned the question on me, asking how I had been, and instead of my usual answer, shrugging, deflecting, pretending, I let it spill out. I told her how overwhelmed I felt, how tired I was of working so hard just to stay afloat, how lonely it sometimes felt to always be the one holding myself up. My voice shook as I admitted it, and I hated the vulnerability, hated how raw it made me feel. But she didn't look at me with pity. She reached out, finally closing that distance, and laid her hand over mine. The warmth of her touch made me tremble, and when I looked at her, the tenderness in her eyes undid me completely. For a moment we just sat there, her hand holding mine, both of us too afraid to breathe too loudly, as if the entire world was listening. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat a demand I could no longer ignore. Then, in the quietest voice, I whispered, "Clara, I'm scared." Her hand squeezed mine gently, and she leaned closer, her breath brushing against my skin. "Of what?" she asked. The question was so simple, but it carried the weight of everything. My eyes burned as I answered, "Of wanting this. Of wanting you." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and once they were free, there was no taking them back. Her breath hitched, and for a second I thought maybe I had ruined everything. But then she whispered back, her voice shaking but steady enough, "You're not alone in that." Her confession settled over me like a blanket, heavy and warm, and I felt the dam inside me break. I turned toward her fully, unable to hold back anymore, and before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in. The kiss was soft, hesitant at first, like both of us were afraid the other would pull away. But when she responded, when her lips pressed back against mine, when her hand slid up to cradle my cheek, it was like the world fell away. The kiss deepened slowly, not rushed, not desperate, but filled with everything we had been holding back for weeks. My entire body trembled as I leaned into her, feeling the truth of everything I had tried to deny. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads rested together, and I could feel her smile against my skin. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," she whispered. "Not with me." Tears stung my eyes again, but this time they weren't from fear or exhaustion, they were from relief, from the overwhelming sense of being seen, chosen, wanted. We stayed like that for a long time, holding on to each other, speaking without words. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, rich with the promise of something new. When she finally pulled back enough to look at me, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I've been waiting for you to say it, she admitted. I didn't want to push you. I didn't want you to think it was about money or comfort. I wanted you to know it was only ever about you. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I felt something deep inside me unravel. I cupped her face in my hands, shaking my head. It was never about that. It's you. It's always been you. The weight of everything unspoken finally lifted, replaced by a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't afraid of her wealth or her scars or the walls she had built. And she wasn't afraid of my struggle or my pride or the chaos of my life. What bound us together was deeper than circumstance. It was the way she looked at me as though I was enough. It was the way I felt alive in her presence, the way I finally believed I deserved to be loved. That night, sitting in her living room with the fire crackling softly and her hand entwined with mine, I realized that what had started as a chance encounter had become the most important part of my life. We didn't talk about the future yet. We didn't make promises or plans. We just let ourselves exist in that moment, in the fragile, beautiful beginning of something we had both longed for but never dared to name. And for the first time in years, I felt safe enough to believe that maybe love wasn't just for other people. Maybe it was for me too. The days after that first kiss moved like a dream, but not the kind that fades when you wake up. It was the kind that lingers, the kind you carry with you long after the sun comes up, the kind that makes every step feel lighter even when the world around you remains heavy. I found myself replaying that night again and again, the warmth of her lips on mine, the way her hand cupped my cheek, the way she whispered that I didn't have to be afraid anymore. And yet, as much as I wanted to stay in that glow, real life didn't disappear. Bills still piled up on my kitchen counter, my car still made strange noises every morning, and exhaustion still tugged at me after every long shift. But the difference was that now I wasn't carrying it all alone. She was there, and her presence, her quiet, steady presence, began to reshape the way I saw my life. Clara didn't overwhelm me with grand gestures after that night. She didn't try to sweep me off my feet with expensive gifts or make promises that felt too big to hold. Instead, she showed up in small, meaningful ways. A thermos of coffee left on my passenger seat because she knew my morning started too early. A scarf she wrapped around my neck before I drove home on a cold evening. Notes tucked into the book she loaned me, little handwritten reminders that I wasn't alone. These were the things that made me fall deeper, not the money she had or the house she lived in, but the way she looked at me like I was worth every ounce of her care. But love has a way of testing you, and ours was no exception. One evening, after an especially rough day where everything seemed to go wrong, I found myself breaking down in front of her. I had tried to hide it, tried to swallow the lump in my throat and force the smile I thought she deserved, but she saw right through me. She always did. "Tell me what's wrong," she said gently, her hand reaching for mine. That simple question cracked me open. The words tumbled out before I could stop them, how hard it was to keep fighting, how heavy it felt to never have enough, how terrified I was that I would never escape the cycle of barely getting by. And worst of all, I admitted the fear I had buried deepest, that one day she would see me as a burden, someone who didn't fit into her world of security and comfort. When the words spilled out, shame burned through me. I couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to see the disappointment I was sure was on her face. But instead of pulling away, she pulled me closer. Her arms wrapped around me, strong and steady, and she held me as if the weight I carried was hers too. "You are not a burden," she whispered fiercely into my hair. "Don't ever say that again. Do you hear me? You are the brightest thing in my life. You are not a burden, you are the reason I breathe easier." Her voice broke on that last word, and it undid me. Tears streamed down my face as I clung to her, letting myself believe for the first time that maybe I didn't have to be ashamed of needing someone. From that night forward, our love grew not because everything was easy, but because we faced the hard things together. I still worked long hours, still drove late into the night, still felt the sting of exhaustion. But now, When I looked up at the stars through my windshield, I thought of her waiting for me, her light in the window like a promise that I wasn't fighting alone. And she, who had once lived behind walls of wealth and loneliness, began to open more of herself to me. She told me stories she had never shared before, about how money had isolated her, how people had used her, how she had learned to guard her heart so carefully that she forgot what it felt like to be seen. With me, she said, she felt human again. And with her, I felt whole. The shift was slow, steady, but undeniable. Her house, once a place I entered nervously, became a home to me. I learned the sounds of its walls, the creak of the floor near the hallway, the rhythm of the wind through its tall windows. I learned the way she liked her tea, the way she hummed softly when she read, the way she whispered my name like it was a secret she had been keeping her whole life. And she learned me, my tired laughter, my restless energy, my fear of losing what we had found. Together, we built something that no money could buy and no hardship could erase. One evening, months later, as the seasons shifted and the air turned crisp, I found myself sitting by her side again, firelight flickering across her face. She looked at me with that same softness I had seen the night she first confessed her feelings, and I realized how far we had come since then. She reached for my hand, her fingers weaving through mine, and whispered, "Do you ever think about the night we met? How it all started with one ride?" I laughed, the sound catching in my throat, because of course I thought about it. It felt like another lifetime, like two strangers fumbling towards something they didn't even know they were starving for. "I think about it all the time," I admitted, squeezing her hand. "I think about how if I had said no, if I hadn't taken that drive, I would have missed the best thing that's ever happened to me." Her eyes shone in the firelight, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said was there, in the way we held each other, in the way we breathed in sync, in the way our silence spoke louder than words. We weren't just two people colliding by chance anymore. We were something solid, something real, something that had been carved out of vulnerability and fear and hope. What began as a transaction, a ride, a payment, a chance encounter, had become the deepest truth of our lives. That night, as I lay beside her, my head resting against her chest, listening to the steady beat of her heart, I realized something that made me smile through the tears that threatened to fall. For so long I had thought love was something fragile, something that broke easily under pressure. But lying there with her, feeling her warmth, her strength, her unwavering presence, I knew the truth. Love wasn't fragile at all. It was resilient, unbreakable, the strongest thing I had ever known. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I wasn't afraid of needing it, of holding it, of letting it change me. Because it already had. And I knew, deep down, it always would.